Well, good morning, Georgianna, and welcome to this week's Take 5. I just want to say thanks to Pastor Corky for allowing me to step in this week while he is on a very, very well-deserved vacation. And he's done an awesome job taking us through the book of James so far. And I love the book of James for a couple of reasons. One, we get to hear from the brother of Jesus, which I feel like is pretty significant. Two, I feel like James is just this New Testament version of Proverbs in several ways. And we're going to come back to that, but it's just full of these really, really helpful little nuggets, just super duper practical. And so we're in chapter 3, and we see that James has some really, really strong things to say about how we can control our speech or how we can tame our tongue, as he likes to say. So we've all been there before where our mouth has gotten us into trouble. Sometimes we say things that we don't mean. Sometimes we intentionally try to hurt someone with a cutting remark. Sometimes in the heat of the moment, something just slips out. And as it's out there, you just want to just grab it from thin air and just throw it back in. But you can't. Once it's out there, it's out there. And so James really pushes us on this because he knows, and we know this too, that so much can go wrong when we're not careful with how we speak to one another. And as Corky talked about last week, James says the tongue is kind of like the bridle in a horse's mouth, or it's kind of like a rudder to a big ship. It's something really, really small that can take things in a totally different direction. It can really have a huge impact on something much bigger. And in those examples, it's not necessarily bad, right? I mean, you have to turn a horse, you have to steer a ship, but there's enormous potential there for good or for disaster. But in our section today, James really just focuses on the disaster side. He only looks at the worst case scenario, this really, really negative side. Like, yes, sometimes when we speak, it can be used for good, but I think he really wants to punctuate this for us that sometimes it can go real bad, real fast if we're not careful. And he says this, James 3:7-8 says, all kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and sea creatures are being tamed and have been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. Okay, so you've got to understand, James has got strong feelings about taming the tongue, right? And this is where he's actually a little bit different than the culture around him. So he's in this ancient Greek culture, and they were certainly aware of the pitfalls of speech when you weren't careful. But also when it was done well, it was a huge value in that culture. Like, this is in the time of rhetoric and philosophy and these great thinkers. And so they had a whole lot of faith and they put a whole lot of weight in the spoken word when it was done well. And so even if it could go wrong sometimes, they put a whole lot of faith in it even still. And James has a much humbler view of speech. In fact, he leans toward this extremely negative view of the potential of what our mouths can do. He says it's a restless evil. It's full of deadly poison. And so the question I have is James telling us just never to speak, right? So one thing you'll notice if you look closely at the book of James is that he kind of announces in chapter 1 some of the places that he's going to go in the rest of the book. And so if we want to get this full picture of what's happening in chapter 3 that we're reading right now, it might be helpful to go back to chapter 1 when he first talks about some of these concepts. And so in chapter 1, verse 19, James says, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And then in verse 26, he says, those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. And so nowhere do you see James telling us just not to speak. That'd be pretty ridiculous, right? But clearly he wants us to be aware that this can go really bad if we're not careful. So quick story, my parents got married when they were 17 and 18 years old. You heard that right, 17 and 18 years old. In fact, my mom got married in April of her junior year, and so her entire 12th grade year, she was a married woman in high school. And so when we would ask them about this when we were kids, they would always give us the same response. They would say, it worked for us, but don't do it, right? It worked for us, but don't do it. This is kind of the sense that I get from this full picture of James. It's not like it's impossible to avoid the disasters of a loose tongue, but it's going to take loads of intentionality and forethought and caution if you're going to avoid these pitfalls. It's not like marriages like my parents never survive. Theirs did, thank God. But it's definitely going to be maybe the exception to the rule. Now, before I get any emails about this, listen, I'm not telling your teenager that they have my permission to get married, right? Just because some of them work out sometimes. That's not the point of the story that I'm trying to make. Here's the point. Some of us love to speak. I speak for a living. Some of us love to share our opinions. We love to share some of our experiences from things that we've learned along the way. Some of us think that we give out golden advice, right? Maybe that's you. I don't know. Some of us love to answer questions that no one is asking. But here's the deal with the ability to say anything and everything that we might want. There's the potential for that to go bad sometimes if we're not careful. Sometimes the tongue is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. And so James tells us back in chapter 1, be quick to listen, slow to speak, not to never speak, but slow to speak. In Proverbs, I love coming back to Proverbs because again, I think James and Proverbs are so similar. Proverbs 17 verse 27, the one who has knowledge uses words with restraint, and whoever has understanding is even-tempered. There's an anonymous quote that says this, better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. So last thing, back in James 3 verse 8, it said, no human being can tame the tongue. No human being can tame the tongue. All the more reason to seek a God who can do it for us. I don't think we're ever going to stop speaking. That seems a little bit unlikely, right? So let's lean on the Holy Spirit who can tame what we say and use it for good. I love you, church. We'll catch you next time.